So let's watch this video.
Early last year, the Food and Drug Administration made an unusual and surprising announcement. It cut the recommended dose of the most popular sleep drug in the country, Ambien, in half for women. It turns out men and women metabolize Ambien, known generically as Zolpidem, very differently, leaving women with more of the drug in their bodies the next morning, and therefore at a greater risk of impaired driving. Ambien, Zolpidem, is now the only prescription drug in the country with a different suggested dose for men and women. But as we first reported in February, it is far from an isolated example of differences between the sexes we never imagined. More and more, scientists are realizing that the differences are dangerously understudied and that pervasively and fundamentally, sex matters. Take aspirin. Low-dose aspirin lowers the risk of heart attacks in healthy men, but in healthy women, turns out it doesn't, though it does protect women against stroke. And drugs are just the beginning. Sex differences have been found in pain receptors, liver enzymes, even the wiring of the brain.
We have generated just a ton of information that suggests that there's sex differences everywhere.
Larry Cahill, a neuroscientist at the University of California, Irvine, used to share his field's assumption that males and females outside the reproductive system were fundamentally the same. But he's changed his outlook 180 degrees. Ambien, he says, is a case in point. Ambien, prescribed 40 million times just last year. Approved 20 years ago, we're only now finding out that women have been prescribed a dose that's twice as high as they need.
That is a textbook example of what's wrong. How did it happen that for 20-some years, women, millions of them, were essentially overdosing on Ambien?
The FDA says it made the change after new driving simulation studies established what amount of Ambien or Zolpidem in the blood the next morning could be dangerous for driving. Dr. Sandra Queter, Deputy Director of the FDA's Office of New Drugs, says only then did they realize women could be taking too much, since women metabolize the drug differently than men.
So if I took Zolpidem and my brother took the same dose, probably the maximum level of drug in my blood would be 45% higher than his maximum blood level.
Now that sounds substantial.
It is substantial.
But we discovered that that 45% difference between men and women had been known to the FDA all along. In the original FDA review of Ambien back in 1992, there was a page called Effect of Gender, where the FDA reviewer noted that two key measures of how much drug is in the bloodstream were approximately 45% higher in females than in males.
It appears to say that they found a significant difference in how this drug is being processed in the body, and then the question is, what did they do with that? And the answer appears to be, they rationalized it away.
I'm going to hand you that page, Effect of Gender.
Okay.
The FDA reviewer went on to write, the results suggest a gender-related difference. However, the lack of specific details, such as study design and individual data, make it difficult to draw a definite conclusion. So when you see that they didn't give you enough data, did you go back or should you have gone back and said, okay, what was the study design? What was the data?
If I saw this today, in light of today's science,
Yes.
I think we would go back and try to tease this out a little bit further. But I think at the time, this was sort of business as usual for what you saw in clinical pharmacology studies.
That's because, she says, there was no evidence at the time that the difference mattered. That was 20 years ago, when if someone said women's health, it usually meant what they call bikini medicine: breast and ovarian cancer, pregnancy, menstrual cycles. But for parts of the body men and women share, hearts, kidneys, the brain, most of the studies were done predominantly on men. If you want to understand me, they study you.
And here's why they do that. Because there's this assumption that you are me with pesky hormones.
Oh, with pesky hormones.
I'm being only partially facetious. The idea is that the fundamental things are similar between you and me. So that, ironically, the best way to study you is to study me. Because when
you don't have pesky hormones.
Right. We're studying all the fundamental things in you without this sort of nuisance stuff. That's literally an assumption on which all of biological medicine, especially neuroscience, which I know best, has been built.
But given what we now know, he says that assumption has to go. Look at heart disease, which is the leading killer of both men and women.
Sorry.
Cardiologist Noelle Berry-Mers from Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles says women, like her patient Pearl Grumette, can differ from men in the way they have heart attacks.
I had this excruciating pain in between my shoulder blades, and then I got the nauseous feeling in my stomach.
So the man comes in, he has chest pain, sometimes a radiating pain down the left arm. The woman comes in.
She might be having stomach upset. She might be feeling fatigue. She might just be short of breath.
Why does she even go?
Because they don't feel right, and they know something's wrong.
They know something's wrong. Did you ever have chest pain in this whole time?
No.
You can see here's the constriction.
Typically, men get clogs in major arteries that are easy to see on an angiogram. But many women get blockages in tiny microvessels inside the heart. So their heart disease is more often missed.
You were having a heart attack.
Pearl had 4 minor heart attacks. 5 different hospitals couldn't find the problem.
Doctor comes in and he says, when you find out what's wrong with you, would you please let me know? Because we don't have any idea what's wrong.
Dr. Berry-Mers says one of the reasons we haven't learned more about women goes all the way back to the beginning of the scientific pipeline to research on animals.
Oh, my goodness gracious me.
Dr. Melina Kibbe is a vascular surgeon who also runs a lab at Northwestern University Medical School, where she evaluates new therapies in mice and rats.
If I walked into a lab anywhere in the country doing animal research, what are my chances of coming upon a study with only male animals?
Very large.
Today.
Correct.
Turns out female rats also have those pesky hormones.
So to control for that variable, most researchers study just males. I was also studying just males.
So it made sense, or you maybe didn't even think about it?
I didn't even think about it.
And neither did Doris Taylor, a leading stem cell expert at Texas Heart Institute in Houston, until she was designing an experiment in mice to see if injections of stem cells could reverse plaque buildup in their arteries. And she needed a way to track the stem cells in the animals.
So what we decided to do is give female animals male stem cells because we could track the Y chromosome. And we said, let's give male animals female cells.
You only did it so you could track the cells.
So we could track the cells.
She was surprised to find the results were not the same.
The male animals we gave female cells got better. And the female animals we gave male cells actually got a little worse.
Only the female stem cells got rid of the plaque.
And you can see all this fat here, the pink.
The male mouse artery on the left had not been treated. The one on the right got female stem cells.
And look at that.
It's clean.
I am embarrassed to admit that as a woman, it had never really occurred to me that doing the experiment in male versus female animals would give completely different results. Stem cells.
And that led to further discoveries. Taylor wanted to find out if human stem cells were different too, and she's found that they are.
My stem cells are actually different stem cells from a man's.
Yes.
She told me men's are less powerful to begin with, and then they start to die off.
In men, as they age, they decrease pretty dramatically, and in females, they stay relatively stable. Now, think about that.
Wow.
Men develop heart disease much earlier than women. Why not look at the difference and see how to make men live longer without heart disease?
She speculates that ignoring this difference may be one reason stem cell treatments haven't lived up to their promise. And on a broader level, that not studying both male and female animals results in more problems for women down the road.
If the whole darn pipeline is male-dominated and sex differences truly do matter, how can it not be the case that you're going to end up with on average, a lot more negative side effects in women than in men. I mean, it basically has to happen.
And it does. A GAO report found 8 of the 10 prescription drugs withdrawn from the market from 1997 to 2001 posed greater health risks for women than for men. Today, when it comes to government-funded studies on humans, women must be included by law. But many researchers don't then take the next step and analyze the results by sex, which some argue defeats the whole purpose.
We have come upon studies where they do use both male and female, but they then don't analyze how the two respond differently. So they have the two and no analysis of the difference.
If you do the two together and you really think females are here and males are here, or vice versa, then you're going to get results that are right here.
And so they're almost
And so
useless.
they're almost not predictive of either males or females.
If you're clumping men and women together in your study, and there truly is a sex difference, you're not just harming the women, you're harming the men. You're muddling up the understanding of what's going on. You're muddling up the path to clear treatment, not just for the women, but for the men as well.
The problem, he says, is that the scientific establishment hasn't caught up with its own discoveries.
If science got Ambien so wrong, does that tell you that we really need to go back and review
Yes,
what, everything?
pretty much everything. Yeah. Is once you see this difference, and that difference, and that difference, and that difference, and that difference, and you see this thing's everywhere, you go, wait a minute. So the assumption we're making that it really doesn't matter, sex, is not a valid assumption. It may not matter. It may matter hugely. It may flip your results on their head, and you don't know. So what happens is you start to realize, wow, the status quo is not okay. The way we're doing business has to change.
There are scientists who
Yes.
say the Ambien situation is like a wake-up call. It's a tip of the iceberg. So should the FDA go back and look at other drugs?
Well, you know, to say every drug, go back and look again,
Yeah.
that's an enormous undertaking.
So can women feel secure that the dosages recommended on any of their medications is proper for them? Or should they now be a little worried?
In medical practice, there is a general awareness that there may be individual differences among patients and that every patient needs to have the right dose.
How's a doctor supposed to know?
You start at the lowest dose and you see if it's enough.
Yeah, but you're doing the studies, and they're going to rely on your recommendation. It sounds like the FDA is being more reactive than aggressive about this.
I think we're being very aggressive about bringing the most sophisticated science to new drugs and being aggressive about applying the science where we have reason to believe there's a concern to older drugs.
In the 3 months since our story first aired, a lot has happened. A bipartisan group of 15 women senators sent an open letter to the FDA commissioner citing our report and asking for better representation of women and analysis of sex differences in drug trials. And just last week, the National Institutes of Health made a major announcement. It will now require scientists to include plans for balancing male and female animals and cells in all government-funded research. The announcement said, our goal is to transform how science is done.
This was from a 2011 review. And what they did was they ranked the 10 top biological disciplines for reporting the sex of human or animal subjects in public paper. And they reviewed this sex bias in research on mammals. And this was for the year 2009. And they found that male bias was evident in 8 disciplines and most prominent in neuroscience with single sex studies, neuroscience. The highest underreporting of sex was in immunology. Okay, the single studies of the male animals outnumbered those of females from 5.5 to 1. Male bias in non-human studies in the past half century has increased, while the male bias in human studies has decreased. So the decline is probably due to the 1993 requirement by Congress that researchers enroll both men and women. However, when they have studies of both sexes, like she said, they often fail to analyze the results by sex. And then when you're looking at animal models, there's underrepresentation of females in animal models of disease, and our understanding of female biology is compromised by these kinds of deficiencies. And the majority of the articles in several journals that are conducted on rats and mice, they're conducted on rats and mice to the exclusion of other useful animals. So they don't have a lot of diversity in the animal models that they choose. So we may be missing certain things there. Like, for example, I think thalidomide affected different animals differently. So you saw faster results if you use guinea pigs versus rats versus mice. There is this persistent belief that there's a variation in non-human female mammals. It's not a founded belief, because what they found is that despite the hormonal cycles, the responses to things that people are looking at stay fairly stable. And so in 2009, only 16% of immunology studies reported both sexes, whereas after a lot of these pushes to get to more sex parity, it's 46% as of 2019. What we know that men and women don't experience infectious or autoimmune diseases in the same way. The male and female immune systems, they respond differently to the flu virus, to HIV, to certain cancer therapies. It's largely the reason that women get a greater protection from vaccines, but also the reason why women are more likely to get severe asthma and autoimmune disorders. And this has been known for a long time. It's known for a long time that women get more autoimmune disorders, but it hadn't been attributed to sex differences. It had been attributed to gender. A lot of times people are like, oh, women just complain more about their pain than men do, but it's the same, or women overreact psychologically, and so they're bringing it on themselves, kind of thing. That was the assumption. However, women are 9 times more likely to get lupus than men. They've been hospitalized at higher rates for some flu strains, and oftentimes, even today, women's pain tends to be diminished because it's perceived as overreacting, over being hysterical. At the same time that women suffer more from the flu and autoimmune disorders, men are more likely to get tuberculosis and COVID-19 and to die of tuberculosis and COVID-19 than women. There's a difference in vaccine response, but they attributed a lot of these differences to the relationship you're in, the norms of the time, the behaviors, and other sociocultural factors, as opposed to actual biological differences. And so in the video, what she was mentioning was this historical practice of bikini medicine, and that notion derives from the fact that they said, if you can't fit it under a bikini, there is no difference. That was the thinking of the time. And so obviously we know that's false. There are differences in the metabolism, the heart, the immune system, but it's important to remember that even though we know biological sex differences happen, there are also sociocultural gender differences. So that both of these work together, and you need to tease out and separate and distinguish between sex and gender, because they both play a role in the susceptibility to diseases and how this works. So, for example, men are more likely to get tuberculosis at 2 times their rate. So they're twice as likely to get it. But you can partly attribute that to the fact that there are immune responses, which is, a sex difference, but also men are more likely to smoke. Men are more likely to work in mining or construction jobs that expose them to toxic substances, which can impair the lungs' immune defense, and that is gender. You need to know the difference between sex and gender to be able to say what is attributable to sex and what is attributable to gender in order to make the proper conclusions. And so how do we tease these apart? That's where animal models really come in. So you understand that gender is a social construct that we associate with humans. Like different cultures, there are different roles for gender, and there's different ways to perform gender. And some cultures have it such that the women are the ones who do math and physics more than the men, but in other cultures, that's, there's women's work and men's work, and all of this are part of gender. And so we associate with that with humans, and so animals don't have gender. But if you see the exact same effect in both animal models and humans, then it's a really good starting point to find out whether this effect that you're seeing, like an immune response, is sex. Because if an animal doesn't have gender and they have the same response as woman, then you know that that is not a gender response, that is sex. But obviously, if you're only studying one sex, you're not going to find sex differences. And so there's a really good example about this. There's this Dr. Sabra Klein, and she's an immunologist, and she was at this scientific conference, and she spoke to a researcher who was studying nematodes. And nematodes are a type of parasitic worm. And they were just talking, and he mentioned that he only did the experiments in male mice. And she was like, well, why? And he was like, well, because the female mice aren't getting infected. And she was like, okay, did you ever study why the female mice aren't getting infected? Because maybe you stumbled across a cure. But he was like, he was so focused on studying the progression of infection, he didn't focus on this difference. And she was like, you might have found a cure. So things like that, when you ignore sex differences before a drug's approval, it can increase the risk of these harmful, life-threatening effects that may be happening and that did happen. So in the previous lecture and in the video, she talked about the 8 out of 10 drugs that were pulled from the market between 1997 and 2001. And those drugs were tested in male cells. They were tested in male rodents and male animals. And when they came on the market, they were really fermented. And so there's still drugs after that, after pulling those, that they miss, like Ambien. And so I'm going to give you a little bit more on Ambien. Let's give a backstory before I start this video. So it came on the market in 1992, and it wasn't pulled until 2013. So yeah, 21 years to be precise. And it was designed to help people sleep. And the active ingredient was zolpidem. And it could cause serious complications, including sleep driving. So like, how you sleepwalk, some people sleepwalk. People were asleep and getting in the car. So it wasn't that they were like, oh, I just took an Ambien and I want to go drive. No, they were in bed asleep, and then they got up and went driving, and they never woke up. And so obviously, if you don't know that you're doing that, you can't stop yourself from doing that. And so that was really dangerous. And in 2013, they started doing these laboratory studies in driving simulations. And they showed that 8 hours after taking zolpidem, right? So this Ambien ingredient, most people, their goal is 8 hours of sleep, right? And so you're not like, I'm going to go sleep for 24 hours. Their goal is 8 hours of sleep. But women still had enough of the drug left in the blood to impair the driving after 8 hours. And it increased the risk of traffic accidents. And that is when, in 2013, after those simulation studies, they set the drug's dosage for women at half the level for men. And when they finally looked at female animals, the female animals also took twice as long to metabolize the Ambien. And so what this video is showing, they're only going to show up to 4 hours after taking the pill, but they've shown that the effects persist up to 10 hours. So this is one of the driving simulations.
This year, Americans will fill about 60 million prescriptions for sleeping pills, including Ambien, the drug that made headlines last month when Carrie Kennedy crashed her car on a highway. Did you know that some sleeping pills can stay in your body for as long as 12 hours? So we wondered, when is it safe to drive? We wanted to see it firsthand, and tonight, ABC's Lisa Stark takes a groundbreaking test.
You are looking at the first test of its kind ever done in the U.S.
Drifted off there for a second.
I'm in a driving simulator, swerving all over the road, nearly hitting a pedestrian, barely keeping my eyes open. I'm not drunk. I'm testing another type of impairment, driving on the nation's most popular sleeping pill, Ambien, and its generic version, zolpidem. There are cases all over the country, those who pop the pill on the way home or try to drive too soon. And perhaps the most terrifying of all, this New Jersey woman had no idea she was even driving. She had taken Ambien and alcohol, gone to bed, ended up on the road. A frightening case of sleep driving.
Hit something with your car.
With 60 million annual prescriptions for sleeping pills pills in the U.S., there's increasing concern. That's what brought us to the University of Iowa and the nation's most sophisticated driving simulator. Researchers watch my every move.
We can see the speed of your vehicle. We have cameras pointed at your eyes, and we're tracking the movement of your pupils.
Big moment to take my sleeping pill.
The drug is designed to act fast, very fast.
So it's been a little over 30 minutes since Lisa took the medicine.
Only 30 minutes.
I'm a little dizzy, but I think I can do it.
I'm wrong.
Am I on the wrong side of the road?
I'm awake enough to know something's not right, but I can't help swerving all over the road.
So this is very dangerous.
She's really stopped blinking.
An indication my brain thinks I'm asleep and that I don't need to blink.
She's really just zoned out. She's sort of in la la land.
After a nap, the maximum ambient stupor. 90 minutes in, I try again.
I just fell asleep. Like totally just fell asleep for a second.
When I tried to make a turn,
That wasn't so good a turn.
and then I smash into a big rig.
No.
Whoa. She was in a real car. This would be the end.
That was like being in Never Never Land.
At 4 hours, 2/3 of the drug gone. I think I'm okay.
Put on your seatbelt.
Okay.
But see this red light? Right through it.
People who are impaired don't necessarily know how impaired they are. So they may think they're driving fine, but they're not.
And remember the woman who never realized she was behind the wheel? I drove 3 times impaired, but recalled only 2. And the minute the car was turned off, I was out like a light.
I feel like that would have been really fun volunteering for that. But so if you take Ambien, be careful and hide your keys from yourself. As of 2017, and this is just 7 years ago now, 75% of rodent drug studies were performed in male rodents. When that happens, why? Why is it still happening when we're knowledgeable about this? Like we know what needs to be done, so why does it still happen? Well, we have to understand that it does cost. Like it takes effort, it takes money to study animals of both sexes. And so if you are asking a researcher to change, you have to understand how the funding situation works for that researcher. There are some scientific reasons that are true, and there are some scientific reasons that are false. For example, so a lot of scientists who have avoided female animals in the past, they didn't want to account for their reproductive cycles, even though female mice, rats, and hamsters tend to be no more variable overall, and in some cases, they're less variable than their male counterparts in traits like gene expression to hormone levels. But other researchers will use only females because, and this one is true, because males are more likely to fight when you put them in a cage. But if you know that this is true, you can also look for ways to get around it. And you can get around this by, if you get the male animals before puberty and you raise them up together for a few weeks, then they're less likely to fight. And so there are ways to avoid this. Some models are only, like, for example, if you're looking at prostate cancer, you only want male animals if you're looking at that. If you want, there's a hypertrophic scarring. It's not quite like keloids. Keloids only happen in humans, but it is excessive scar tissue. And there is a pig model, but it only happens in the female animals. And so there are reasons that you still might want to look at one model. But a lot of times, for the most part, that's not what's happening when people only look at one. So for example, even though 3 times as many women have multiple sclerosis as men, in the 1990s, a lot of immunologists ignored the idea that this difference could have any kind of biological basis. So there was a neurologist at UCLA, and her name was Dr. Rhonda Voskal. And she was talking about the attitude at the time, and she said people would say, oh, the women just complain more, they're hysterical. And it was really difficult to convince people that it wasn't subjective, it wasn't environmental, that it was just basic biology. So for her, it was an uphill battle. And so that's the gender bias that was happening. But what she did a similar study to the one that was talked about in the video, but she was doing it intentionally. So she took male and female mice, and she wanted to understand why female mice were so much more susceptible to autoimmune diseases like lupus and multiple sclerosis. And she wanted to understand if it was like hormonal, what was happening. And so there was this well-studied mouse model of multiple sclerosis And up until that point, researchers only looked at the female mice because the female mice were more likely to get that disease. And that's one of the cases where the symptoms were worse, and that's why people focused on them. But she was like, okay, well, why? She zeroed in on that difference. And among other things that she did, she took immune cells from mice of one sex, so female immune cells, and from the multiple sclerosis model, and male immune cells from the multiple sclerosis model, and put them in the healthy animals of the opposite sex, right? And she found that if the immune cells were derived from the females, they were more likely to induce the disease than immune cells that were derived from the males. And that finding made it very clear to all the other researchers that, number one, it wasn't gender. Number two, it wasn't hormones, because the female ones induced it in the males. And if it were just hormones, that wouldn't have happened. Now, they do think there is a role for gender in this as well, because women are generally more likely to seek healthcare. And so if you're a man with lupus and a woman with lupus, and you're just like powering through it because of gender roles and kinds of things, then your lupus is not going to be diagnosed and reported as an incidence. And so they know that understanding both is important, but understanding that it's also sex, that it's also a biological basis, helps with finding better treatments. In 2010, this researcher, she looked at publicly available data that others had already published, but they hadn't stratified it by sex. And so it was this longstanding, really effective vaccine for yellow fever. And what she did is she tried to stratify all this existing data by sex. And she found that there was a difference in the immune response to the vaccine, where females experienced a stronger and better response to the vaccine, which likely led to better protection. And other researchers thought that this was the fact that just analyzing someone else's already published data and finding a new finding in it is a huge contribution to the field, because it shows the real value of analyzing data by sex. And before that, it was a blurry result. It was a spread out result. And then instead of having this like giant, I guess, bell curve, they got two peaks, right? And that's important to know. And so she's also started investigating what most of the people at that time didn't understand why. It was like, this seems to be some kind of mystery. And so she wanted to know, well, why do women tend to have better protection from flu vaccines, but also at the same time, more severe responses to the flu? And she found that, and again, at the time was like, oh, women are just more complainy about the flu, like be a man kind of thing was the attitude at that time. And so the female mice infected with the flu had more severe inflammation. They had more severe tissue damage in their lungs. So the damage was worse than the males, and more severe outcomes overall because of really strong immune systems. Before you have the antibody response, though, which is the adaptive immune system, the adaptive immune system is really targeted, and it will target the virus particles. It'll slap. I like to think of it like a sniper. So you know how a sniper will paint an object with a laser, and then the missile can hone in on that object because it detects the laser. If you watch enough movies like I do, that's something you see all the time. So that's what antibodies are like. They paint it for the immune system, because the immune system, those cells can't see it, but unless an antibody is tagged on it, it takes about 10 to 12 days for your body to make antibodies. Before that, you have natural killer cells, and natural killer cells act like carpet bombing, right? And so if you have a really hugely strong immune response, your natural killer cells are going to go and kill everything. They're just like bombing the crap out of everything. So the damage that is happening is your own body damaging it, right? And so that's why they get such severe damage to their lungs and such severe inflammation, because your body is just like carpet bombing the heck out of it. These sex differences, this really strong immune response affects how we respond to viruses. And so women have more adverse events after vaccines because they have a super strong immune system. And this has long thought to be gender, like maybe men are having the same response but aren't reporting it. But there's more and more evidence saying it's biological. They think that women are more likely to report perceptions of pain. And so they were just lumping all of that into gender and not looking at sex. But by 2000, Dr. Klein and a lot of other people showed that in addition to any kind of gender contribution, females needed a lot less vaccine to mount the same antibody response as men. And she thought that if you gave females a lower dose and still was effective, maybe their responses wouldn't be so severe and like getting sick after a vaccine. And she thought that that might lead to less vaccine hesitance. Other researchers have found a lot of these findings groundbreaking. And one said, you know, based on this research, maybe we should have differential vaccination programs based on sex. The problem, though, is that giving women a lower dose of the flu vaccine, it could potentially be equally effective while reducing side effects, while maybe reducing vaccine hesitancy. It becomes administratively difficult. It hasn't really gained traction, even though different researchers have pushed it. Researchers, they've come to this agreement that, yeah, this would be a great idea, but lawmakers and policymakers have not come to that same conclusion. And so when we're dealing with government versus research, policy is difficult to, just because you have more annoying symptoms when they're not life-threatening, it's difficult to get policymakers to see the value in changing the status quo. Like there has to be a really strong driver. And so far, they are not convinced by that. But if you look at it from a different perspective, we already do that for people over 65. They get a higher dose of the flu vaccine than younger adults. Women aren't the only ones who might benefit from vaccine policies. Like, for example, if you look at the number of deaths in men to COVID-19, it's much higher than women. And it gets really drastic once these men get older. If you have maybe older men get a booster of COVID vaccine at an earlier rate, or the third dose for them is really important. They also might benefit from a mid-season flu booster shot. And there's no currently available mid-season booster shot for flu vaccines. If we want the research on sex differences to really impact health across all sexes and genders, we really also have to know how sex specifically interacts with gender. Early on, when we were looking at reports of COVID-19 and we saw that men were dying more than women, very early on, people thought it was because of gender differences. They thought it was smoking behavior. They thought it was difference in desire to go for care. Like, I don't need to go to the hospital kind of thing. But as it spread worldwide and the men, no matter which country, which culture, consistently died more than women, they consistently died more than women if you exclude race. So there was a 2021 study that found that in certain regions, Black women died at 3 times the rate of white and Asian men. So if you ignore race and you just look at sex, the researchers who examined sex did not believe that it was purely gender. And they found in a hamster model of the disease that the males got sicker and got more damage to their lungs and got more pneumonia-like symptoms, which was very similar to what was reported in humans. So they had the proof, hey, it's biological. But while you can look at just sex in animals, looking at just sex in humans is really complicated by sociocultural factors like race and gender. For example, and COVID-19, really, you can look at the difference in sociocultural factors because there was a lot of differences among huge swaths of people. There's whether or not you wanted to wear a mask, whether or not you wanted to get vaccinated, whether or not you were exposed at work. What is your work? Is your work outdoors? Is your work in caregiving? And most caregiving roles, like nurses, are handled by women, right? And so what kinds of fields were you in? And that all of that fed into your risk of acquiring the disease, but not only acquiring the disease, what is your viral load? Because your load at the time can impact how well you do. If you start off with like the minimum amount that is infectious. It's going to take longer for that to replicate into symptomatic. And during that time, your body has more time to build the antibodies. Women were often more exposed in certain cases, like nurses, teachers, caregivers of sick family members. And I kid you not, every time my kids are sick, it doesn't matter what I do, they manage to time it to cough directly into my open mouth. And so every single time, it's like it's on purpose, but it hasn't mattered how old they were. And so I can attest to that. One of the things that they have hypothesized is that female immunity is stronger because of reproduction, and it shows across many different species, from sea urchins and fruit flies to birds to rodents to macaques and to humans. And they said, if you look at it from a Darwinian perspective, right, perhaps there's some kind of evolutionary reason why these differences have evolved. And one hypothesis suggests that a stronger immune response in female mammals could help transfer more antibodies to the babies in utero and through breast milk. And that would protect any kind of offspring from infection after it was born. Or maybe a fast response may help to kill the infection. So this is killing the infection, this is not killing the infection, and then the baby is damaged or killed. It could be for either of these reasons, but the same heightened immune responses that help keep a baby alive also seem to increase the risk of autoimmune diseases when females are older, but the trade-off may be worth it from an evolutionary standpoint. So this is really recent research as of 2024. Exist has been known for a while, but this conclusion that I'm about to describe has not. So that's the recent research. So the sex differences in the immune system, they often really play out on the X chromosome, and the X chromosome has a lot of genes involved in immune signaling and in immune response. Having two X chromosomes really differs in terms of immune response than having one X and one Y. So two X chromosomes can mean twice as many copies of some of these immune genes, but to make the expression roughly equivalent, like your body is trying to make the expression of genes in a female equivalent to that in a male, like it wants similar expression. And so what it'll do, it will silence one of those X's, right? And so every cell in a female's body will epigenetically silence one of those two X chromosomes randomly. And it does it through the action of this long non-coding RNA, which is called exist, right? And exist forms this ribonucleic protein complex, and it has these binding proteins that attach to the X chromosome, and it attaches the X chromosome in every single cell in the body. And that's how it silences it. So it's like, this X chromosome is extra, you will now be quiet. And that will keep it so that it can't express genes. And because it can't express genes, people with XX express roughly the same amount of genes as people with XY, because now one is silent. And so in principle, only one copy of all these genes that are associated with the X chromosome, but some X chromosome genes can evade that silencing. And one of them is called toll-like receptor 7. And it's been implicated in a number of these sex differences in the immune system. And it plays an important role in recognizing pathogens and in activating the immune system. So if we eliminate this toll-like receptor 7, then we can eliminate the female biased antibody and immunity protection following vaccination, right? And so all of the females who have toll-like receptor, they have an improved immunity over male animals. Whereas if you get rid of toll-like receptor 7, it looks pretty much the same. Without it, female immunity is equivalent to male immunity. So one of the things that has been recently found is that TLR7, it might also play a role in explaining why women tend to have a stronger immune response to HIV than men. And they didn't know about this immunological sex difference in the 1990s. And at that time, who was eligible for HIV therapy based on how much virus people had. So this was called the viral load. But the immune response to the virus is what determines the severity of the disease, whether or not HIV will become AIDS, not the viral load. But at that time, they just said, well, your viral load is low. And so they didn't give women who should have received the treatment because they didn't understand that TLR7 was likely what was reducing the viral load. And it was a big hole in policy and understanding of science. And so a lot of women who should have been eligible for getting HIV therapy did not. And so this is the case where not looking at sex differences really had a clinically significant impact on treatment recommendation. For the longest time, female hormones or gender was thought to be the cause of autoimmune disorders, but the evidence really didn't support it. For example, there's this syndrome called Klinefelter syndrome, where people have XXY and they're phenotypically male. You wouldn't know it unless you did a genetic test. They have male hormone patterns, but they have an elevated risk of autoimmune disease that matches females, people with XX. That disproves that autoimmune diseases are due to hormones, right? That gave more evidence that it's due to having a second X, right? And so many of the binding proteins on this excess ribonucleic protein are autoantigenic. And so researchers were like, well, maybe having excess is what the problem is, not having the second X chromosome, right? And so what they did, and it was kind of a clever study, what they did is they took these male mice and they caused them to genetically express a form of the excess ribonucleic protein that would not silence their X chromosome. Obviously, because they need this X chromosome. If it's silenced, that's going to be fatal, but it's just there, but it's not silencing anything. And the male mice wound up developing autoantibodies, and they found that after developing these autoantibodies, they started developing symptoms. Just having excess alone is sufficient for causing this problem. So sex chromosomes also interact with hormones such as testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, and these hormones themselves can directly influence immunity. And just about every single cell in your body has receptors that sex hormones can bind to and then regulate gene expression. Even though the excess appears to be an X chromosome appear to be involved in immunity, that's not to say that hormones aren't also, right? So estrogen protects female mice against the flu by dampening inflammatory response and increasing antibody responses to vaccination. And it could be that this applies to humans as well. When they looked at both old women and young women, the antibody response to the flu vaccine was not related to age, it was related to level of estrogen. And so some older women are taking estrogen replacement therapy, and those women responded like younger women. Whether a disease changes after puberty or menopause or during pregnancy, it can give you hints about the involvement of the sex hormones. So pregnancy is really good for people with multiple sclerosis. It makes them go into remission. And there's a specific type of estrogen, estriol, that is only around during pregnancy. There's a researcher who identified this and decided to look at estriol in clinical trials as a potential treatment against multiple sclerosis. And so far, the results look very good. Another disease where hormones seem likely to play a role is in asthma, and its prevalence changes after puberty. So before puberty, asthma is more prominent in boys than in girls. And then after puberty, it becomes more common and severe in women than in men. And in mice, if you remove androgens like testosterone, you get increased asthma symptoms, increased asthma-like symptoms, because they don't call them asthma in mice, they call it asthma-like. But if you remove estrogen, you decrease the asthma. So increased estrogens worsens asthma, increased androgens improves asthma. Obviously, they're probably not going to use testosterone therapy on women who are cisgender to improve their asthma, but they're looking at the effects of similar hormones like DHEA, which doesn't have systemic effects. And it could also be a useful tool in preventing asthma. And so there's plenty to investigate about the role of sex hormones, plenty to investigate about the role of chromosomes. It's also becoming really clear that there are different types of sex differences that affect genes outside of the sex chromosome. For example, there's microbial activity in our digestive system, and we've got 10 trillion to 100 trillion microbes and their associated genomes. And our gut microbiomes differ between males and female, and they are known to influence the immune system, but there's also like a gut-brain axis, so it also influences the brain. The research into other mechanisms underlying these differences are still in their infancy. So this is the problems of the gut biome. But finally, researchers are trying to understand the entire gender spectrum, including people who are non-binary or transgender. So some of this has been historically underrepresentation because it's harder to include because of the way that these groups feel treated in medical research, either because they don't feel welcome or there's a drastic underrepresentation of gender and sexual minorities in clinical research. In the past, it has been treated like, oh, it's all in your head or you're being ridiculous. And so a lot of trans and non-binary people have zero interest in interacting with the medical community. But several researchers are trying to get surveys. They want to kind of create a gender score so that they can use that in their data. So like gender-related behavior, gender attitudes, to generate this gender score that they can use to allow scientists who are doing these studies to look at the influence of gender on health and disease, separate from the effects of biological sex and gender identity. And so there's this one immunological trial, and it's looking at the effects of hormone therapy and gender identity in a cohort of transgender women. And the researcher is particularly interested in looking at them because they're at high risk for getting HIV. And so the hormone therapy, it can change the immune response. So that would be like gender and sex, but social factors could lead to increased sex and could also potentially change the immune response. And so that is gender and gender identity. And so the goal is to understand these effects and take them into account when studying potential HIV treatments or cures. And finally, the study of intersex people is still lacking. They have variations in sex chromosomes, reproductive anatomy, genes, and hormones that don't fit typical notions of male and female bodies, but being able to fully understand and account for the variety of sex and gender diversity, it's going to help our knowledge of health and disease for everybody. And it might increase our just scientific knowledge of how sex, chromosomes, hormones, genes, and gender interact to influence the immune system and the susceptibility to disease. And so hopefully this will lead to better care, medicine, and vaccines for everyone. And with that, thank you for your attention.